Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with preliminaries. For those of you who may not know, I'm Walter Sterling, the Dean of St. John's College in Santa Fe, and I'm pleased to welcome you all from near and far and all parts of our community to our lecture this evening and to the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series in Santa Fe. As many of you know, we've had a nice run of lectures on campus this fall, and we've been having many outside to take advantage of the good weather. But we're also happy to take advantage of this format that we used, to say liberally would be an understatement. We used it exclusively last year through the disruption. And we know it allows other members of our community to join us. And this evening, we're particularly pleased to welcome our low residency graduate students from near and far, and any Johnny family members who are joining us as part of Johnny Family Weekend. Looking ahead, next week we'll be back in person on our campus, but we do have at least one more online lecture scheduled later this semester. So please keep looking at the lecture calendar and joining us in person or online as your circumstances permit. In a moment, I will pass things on to our lecturer. Mr. Winslow will speak for, I believe, somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour for the lecture proper. And then we will conclude this webinar and we will open a Zoom meeting. The link was provided in advance, but I'll also put it in the chat for a minute or two before we close the webinar. We'll move into a Zoom meeting where we can see each other and interact for the question period, which will probably go on for about another hour after that. So please join us for that if you're available and want to continue the conversation. So with that, please join me in, first of all, I thank Tutor Russell Winslow for his willingness to join us this way and share his talk and enter conversation with us. And please join me in welcoming Tutor Russell Winslow, whose lecture tonight is titled Idiotic Modesty in Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. Thank you so much, Mr. Winslow, for sharing your thoughts with us this evening.
Thank you, Walter, for that warm welcome. And thanks everyone for coming, or perhaps I should say for tuning in. This lecture originally came into being as a consequence of a couple of reading groups that I did on Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. One was with Mr. Slover, who was at Emory at the time, and one was with Miss Revolution, Vidya Revolution. And during both of those reading groups, I began to notice that one of the things one of the concepts that continually emerges in Deleuze multiple times is this idea of modesty. And in Difference and Repetition, it occurs perhaps 8 times over the course of the text, and frequently in association with the concept of philosophy. And I began to wonder what he means by philosophical modesty, because as I said in the blurb, often it's rare, in fact, that we think of modesty as a character trait of someone who's offering arguments. So I wondered then, what could he mean by philosophical modesty? Now, the lecture will introduce this problem in the first section. And in the second section, I will attempt to develop the concept of transcendental stupidity, a concept that Deleuze claims he locates in Flaubert. So to that end, I will analyze a couple of the novels of Flaubert in order to try to elucidate this strange formulation, this strange concept. And a consequence of that description is a rather pessimistic view of human nature, at least insofar as Flaubert articulates it. But for Deleuze, he appropriates transcendental stupidity in a more affirmative sense, And so in the third section of the paper, I'm going to attempt to develop that concept in the more affirmative sense, and also bring it back into alliance or relation with the idea of philosophical modesty. So in chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition, the image of thought, Deleuze offers a meditation on an often repeated question in the history of philosophy. Where does philosophy begin? The answer to this question has often implied some sort of intellectual act by which thought may be released from the tethers of its own presuppositions. And one famous example in the catalog of attempts to sweep the tangles of confused textual chatter from a solid ground upon which truly philosophical thinking can begin lies in Descartes' Meditations. There, Descartes employs the method of doubt. He actively suspends belief and places into doubt all sensuously and discursively derived knowledge, until he arrives at a foundational proposition that he observes cannot be doubted. I think, therefore I am. In other words, he believes he has brushed aside all presuppositions that have hitherto encumbered the tradition of thought, and that with this new foundation, he occasions a true philosophical beginning. For Deleuze, however, a subtending presupposition remains in Descartes. Quote, "It is presumed that everybody knows, independently of concepts, what is meant by self, thinking, and being." Quote. Descartes' beginning itself rests upon a presupposition. Namely, it lies upon the unquestioned ground of everybody knows, which is to say, of common sense. Insofar as Descartes appeals to the everybody knows of clarity and distinctness as the measure of legitimate thought, Deleuze argues he has not escaped the philosophical tradition from which he wishes to disentangle himself. Invoking the specter of Heidegger's Das Man, Deleuze writes, quote, "Everybody knows. Everybody knows in a pre-philosophical and pre-conceptual manner. Everybody knows what it means to think and to be. As a result, when the philosopher says, 'I think, therefore I am,' he can assume that the universality of his premises, namely what it means to be and to think, will be implicitly understood, and that no one can deny that to doubt is to think and to think is to be." End quote. While his description here remains attributed to Descartes, Deleuze thinks that the presumption of this specific metaphysical ground, namely common sense, links Descartes to his philosophical predecessors. In opposition to this hegemonic tradition of Western philosophy, Deleuze argues that the phenomenon of thinking has too often been associated with common sense. In one way or another, common sense has been the measure of thinking, the foundation upon which thinking is legitimated and supported. Moreover, as a measure of thought, Deleuze believes that the touchstone everybody knows actually inhibits and restricts the phenomenon of thinking. It even signals perhaps the death of thinking. And as such, if philosophical activity begins with thinking, then common sense cannot serve as a beginning of philosophy. For him, the description of the phenomenon that exhibits a thinking that initiates philosophical activity shows itself in opposition to common sense, in opposition to what everybody knows. Rather than the clarity and comfort generated by participating in the brotherhood of assent, which subtends common sense, Deleuze suggests that thinking emerges from something more akin to an isolated and passionate confusion of an outsider. Quote, "Here and there, isolated and passionate cries are raised against common sense," end quote. Instead of integrating into or squaring with public opinion, these rare and disturbing cries against the hegemonic rule of common sense betray a certain idiosyncratic and isolated condition. idiosyncratic etymologically understood. Does thinking reveal its presence in the character of a person with perfect confidence in understanding what occurs around him? Is self-assurance the disposition which appears when one thinks, such that what one thinks may be distributed without confusion or question through a population of rational beings? For Deleuze, no. In contrast to confidence, thinking engenders an idiotic modesty, a humility originating from a form of intellectual isolation, an idiotic individuation. The use of this term, modesty, marks an important qualification. By placing thoughts in opposition to common sense, one may be led to believe that Deleuze's thinker is granted an elevated position vis-a-vis common sense. But with the formulation of modesty as a fundamental characteristic of philosophical activity, thinking cannot be described in aristocratic terms. Rather, the modesty of the person undergoing thought might be said to be engendered by the fact that they do not quite see what this everybody is talking about. Quote, "It is a question of someone with a necessary modesty, not managing to know what everybody knows, and modestly denying what everybody is supposed to recognize," end quote. It is precisely this contrast between the isolation of a thinking grounded in humility and modesty with the self-evidence and universality of common sense that one may wish to borrow from Deleuze and bring to bear on the contemporary form of discourse that proliferates, for example, in social media. It strikes me that much of political thinking or political discourse that takes place in the blogosphere is particularly susceptible to a criticism of this sort, whether the politics is right or left-wing. Everyone proceeds from the assumption that her thoughts and political commitments proceed from a position of common sense. Whatever the position, the rhetorical comportment of the blogger, the poster, the tweeter, shapes the argument by having it appeal to common sense, to what everybody knows, and to what no one could deny. That is to say, the principal gesture of the political righteous indignation moving through social media seems rarely initiated with modesty, but always in alignment with common sense, and therefore the status quo. And yet the status quo is precisely the structure that these movements believe that they are challenging. The phenomenon giving rise to cancel culture, for instance, may rely, in fact, on common sense in a rather unconscious and unperceived manner. However, in my view, the danger in the form that the discourse of social media often takes runs the risk of forgetting the ecological organization of our common sense prejudices. Insofar as one forgets this, it becomes much easier to simply exclude one's own involvement, one's own participation, one's own culpability, and one's own finitude. For example, the assertion that we must ban a thinker or author from university curricula may be a way, perhaps, of precluding our own finitude, of our own culpability and participation. This decisive prescription presumes a number of problematic metaphysical commitments in advance. By banning authors, I project the culpability for the prejudices in the historical and ecological situation of us all onto a singular scapegoat. I exclude myself from the ecological situation. But we all belong to this situation. To the situation, the ecological situation that these problematic ideas have generated. We are sustained within this symbolic inheritance system. Does not affecting the disposition of righteous indignation and demanding the prescription of excluding authors for these reasons presume that I am infinitely transparent to myself, as if I were a Cartesian subject having already conducted the project of doubt? that my motivations and prejudices are completely clear to me, and that I may purge these free-floating prejudices affecting other people by simply excluding individuals. Hermeneutically speaking, perhaps we are always already culpable and cannot so easily achieve this sort of artificial distance from the horizon of our prejudices. The righteous indignation that we observe in social media and other places, therefore, would seem to be a comportment precisely in opposition to what Deleuze names modesty. Instead, it serves as a mechanism of common sense, perhaps, reproducing and disseminating what everybody knows and what no one could deny. But insofar as it may serve to characterize the initiation of thinking, what does this philosophical modesty mean? Especially if we are to employ it as a kind of corrective to the discursive modes of social media. In the second section, as I mentioned before, I plan to develop this concept of transcendental stupidity that Deleuze locates in Flaubert. So I'm going to turn to that section of the paper now. And in the effort of fleshing this out, I'm going to look at two novels. One is Madame Bovary, and the other is Bouvard and Pécuchet. Deleuze employs the language of philosophical modesty again in the context of developing what he calls the fifth postulate of the image of thought that supports the measure of common sense. Now, in chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze offers a list or a series of postulates that he argues support the idea of common sense in Western philosophy. And the one I'm going to work on now is the fifth postulate. And that is that the presumption, the fifth postulate, is the presumption in Western thinking that error is the sole negative opposed to thought. Common sense has been supported in Western philosophy through the privilege of innateness from Descartes and recollection and recognition from Platonism. Relying on the ground of common sense, the true becomes something left over after the method of doubt has been employed. All confusion has been swept away, and all that is left is what no one can deny, and anyone with an innate faculty of reason can clearly see. In his meditations, Descartes cautions us against making judgments without this clarity. For unless the judge has reached the supposed tabula rasa upon which prejudice is sacrificed, error may ensue. For Deleuze, such error may be described as false recognition. It is therefore interpreted according to the same metaphysical key through which the true of common sense is made visible. Truth and error circulate within an exhaustive closed system of the cogitatio natura universalis. But phages appear within the body of this ecological order, the presence of which indicates cracks or openings within the closed ecosystem of common sense. In particular, Deleuze cites what he calls the terrible trinity of madness, stupidity, and malevolence. For Deleuze, these three negatives to thought are incapable, in fact, of being reduced to error. In the following analysis, I'm going to focus on stupidity. First and foremost, stupidity is not simply an error. The speaker who states, "Good morning, Theodorus," when Theotitus is passing, does not suffer from stupidity. Rather, we might call this a case of error, or perhaps of distraction. The stupid act carries a deeper, more profound signification. Quote, "The best literature, Flaubert, Baudelaire, Bouvard, was haunted by the problem of stupidity. By giving this problem all its cosmic, encyclopedic, and gnosiological dimensions, such literature was able to carry it as far as the entrance to philosophy itself. Philosophy could have taken up the problem with its own means and with the necessary modesty by considering the fact that stupidity is never that of others, but the object of a properly transcendental question. How is stupidity, not error, possible? In the novels of Flaubert, one is confronted with what can be described as a transcendental dilemma. Emma Bovary is corrupted already in her youth, but by what? Could point to the romantic novels she devoured as a child. Indeed, as everybody knows, Flaubert said that if she had not read these novels, her life might have been different. As such, it is tempting to read the novel not as a tragedy, but as a moral tale, warning us against the dangers of reading romantic novels. Or perhaps the caution is a political one. These novels were given to her by a former aristocrat who was rendered impoverished and reduced to the life of a seamstress to earn her bread. If one conceives of the life of the former aristocrat mirroring in some way Emma's future, then we may be justified in reading these scenes as an indication of a kind of forged link between the imaginary life expressed in romantic novels and the infatuation with the life pre-revolutionary counts and countesses. Here then would lie Flaubert's critique of those with royalist sympathies. But surely the novel is deeper than either a moral or a political caution. For the situation bespeaks a perplexity that belongs not only to Emma, or to those who would romanticize the lives of royalty, but to discursive beings as such. For, quote, stupidity is never that of others, quote. Human beings live their lives in the context of a world that is largely organized by systems of the imagination. Human imaginary structures coat the entire world with meaning, and they do not originate exclusively or even primarily in solipsistic individuals in an I think. Rather, the symbolic inherited systems that we inhabit are shared. The relationship between these shared imagined realities and the individuals that inhabit these realities is enormously complex. And it is precisely within this relation that the problem of stupidity emerges. For this reason, la bêtise probably does not belong to the non-human animal. La bêtise is the term that Deleuze uses for stupidity in this context. He could have used other words, but it's la bêtise he chose. And he argues that it may not belong to the non-human animal. If the logos, in its broadest articulation, is the medium through which these imaginary realities are engendered and proliferated, then stupidity seems to belong most exquisitely to the discursive animal who lives in the ecosystems organized by the social, political, and cultural imagination. For Flaubert, the shock, terror, and even impulse toward laughter that often accompany the experience of being in the face of stupidity shine forth most prominently when a human has a head full of propositions and facts. Nothing prevents even true propositions and facts from constituting the imaginary world in which stupidity shows itself. And this is illuminated most clearly in the tragic comedy of Bouvard and Pécuchet, Flaubert's incomplete final novel. In a certain way, the problem exhibited is the same in Madame Bovary. Each are inheritors of imaginary realities through the books that they read, the stupid inhabitation of which eventually destroys them. On the one hand, the soul of Emma Bovary is corrupted by its inscription within a romantic world in which princes arrive to sweep princesses off their feet and ride away on horseback into the sunset. Similarly, in the case of Bouvard and Pécuchet, the reader is presented with two figures who are incapable of embracing the bourgeois roles in the imagined lives that they've inherited. They are both unmarried copyists, somewhere in the last half of their careers. and they too consume many books, books which goad their imaginations. As a consequence of their shared study, they detest their mediocre bourgeois surroundings and dream of a life in the countryside. A romanticized vision of a life of gardens and butterflies and a leisure that affords the indulgence of curiosity and scientific enterprise. Suddenly, Bouvard inherits a life-changing sum of money. Chance, thereby, curses them with the opportunity to live inside this bubble of abundant leisure, the romantically conceived lot of men of certain action. Agricultural, architectural, scientific, religious, mystical, and political action, they do it all. They purchase a property in the countryside and begin their education. The scope of their reading in this new foreign setting is enormous. They move from discipline to discipline, and the consequences of these crash courses of learning are disastrous, as Bouvard and Pécuchet struggle to put their theories into practice. One after another, they try to birth the images derived from these books into the world. The pace is dizzying. Time and again, their efforts lead to absurd and disappointing conclusions that push them toward opposite theories or contrasting disciplines from which they try again to compose new worlds. In short, in every case, inhabiting the environments composed by the images provided by the books leads to stupidity and stupefaction. As such, there is something tragic about stupidity, especially insofar as it is a danger to which we are all perhaps unavoidably susceptible. Stupidity involves inhabiting a world delineated and carved out by the imagination in such a way that the organization achieved by these ghosts of the imagination carry the meaning of common sense, even though observers would find any conclusion derived thereby as absurd. As is evident by the sheer volume of Bouvard and Pécuchet's consumption of learned and perhaps less learned disciplines. Flaubert apparently studied some 1,500 texts in preparation for this novel. Sophisticated knowledge systems are no fail-safe against the transcendental conditions by which stupidity is possible. Bouvard and Pécuchet are equally ruined by both celebrated intellectual achievements and crackpot theories. Flaubert's recognition of la bêtise in both pseudoscience and science proper may be betrayed in the narrator's comments after Bouvard and Pécuchet's adventure in the form of a seance called table turning. Apparently, if a group of people hold hands while sitting around certain kinds of tables, the table may turn, or one may hear taps, at which time it is possible to pose questions to the spirits about the living and the dead. After Bouvard and Pécuchet spend some time testing a variety of tables for their paranormal effects, our narrator comes out and addresses the reader. Quote, "The phenomenon of table turning is nonetheless certain. The common herd attribute it to the spirits. Faraday to prolonged nervous action, Chevreul to unconscious efforts, or perhaps, as Segouin admits, there is evolved from the assembly of persons an impulse, a magnetic current," end quote. These words leave the reader with a distinct impression of having been left in an entire ecosystem organized by la bêtise. Humans are driven into tremendous work and research by the most absurd of images, which convey meaning within their fantastic inherited realities. Consider all of the argumentation and disagreement, all of the societies of research established and innumerable positions staked out, all of the effort exerted and perhaps even life lost in the service of making claims about table turning. The broader view reveals the absurdity of this imagined ecosystem composed by chatter, regardless whether the arguments are prolonged by Faraday or the neighborhood clairvoyant. The novel, therefore, would appear to exhibit great suspicion regarding the conclusion that scientific knowledge leads to human progress. That is to say, stupidity as an a priori possibility within all human endeavors, qua human, checks humanism's optimistic expectation of human progress. Insofar as the possibility of stupidity always accompanies the discursive mode in which the human inhabits meaning in the world, the promise of science as a method by which we may step outside of our finitude remains limited. Reason is not immune to such stupidity, to the limits of finitude. Even in the circumstances in which one possesses all of the true propositions of a science, even when all the facts are clearly known and there are no errors in one's perception or premises, one may still inhabit that world stupidly. Indeed, the novel suggests as much by placing Bouvard and Pécuchet in their particular vocation. Our two characters are professional copyists. On the one hand, by selecting such a career, the novel observes their lack of originality. As imitators, they copy any text that is placed in front of them. Yet on the other hand, their professional identity signals two further characteristics. First, given that the novel presents them as having had a professional lifetime of cultivating the skill of imitation, it would seem that they are capable, perhaps even excellent, at imitating all of the propositions, facts, and theorems that they read. Indeed, regardless of the discipline to which they devote themselves, the stupidity of Bouvard and Pécuchet does not lie in having copied the propositions improperly. They are stupid despite having true propositions, perhaps even because of them. Secondly, their professional life indicates that for the novel, Bouvard and Pécuchet are all of us. As human beings, we are inheritors of an imagined shared reality that we neither empirically construct nor consciously compose. We rather appropriate our symbolic imagined realities through the endeavor of copying, of imitating, or to use Aristotelian language, of being habituated to them. And this is a tragic comic consequence of reading the novel. We are compelled to laugh at the tragedy befalling Bouvard and Pécuchet. But in doing so, we fail to perceive that we are laughing at a mirror. So the image of transcendental stupidity as presented by the novels of Flaubert, at least on this interpretation, leave us in a rather pessimistic circumstance and situation. The third section attempts to elaborate Deleuze's more positive appropriation of it. For Deleuze thinks that it's a central structure to thought, to thinking, out of which a world becomes generated and produced and is novel. In addition, as I said before, I'm going to link together the concept of modesty with this idea of transcendental stupidity. While Flaubert's writing attends to the ghosts of stupidity in all human knowledge systems in order to inscribe the presumption of human progress in the broader architectonic of tragedy, is there something about stupidity to be affirmed? Bouvard and Pécuchet remain cogs in the wheel of generality. There's no originality or generation or production in copying propositions. Sense does not lie in the propositions. To be sure, the results are stupid, but is there nevertheless some way that stupidity can be an Ursprung, a wellspring of origination? In her book on stupidity, Avital Ronell invokes something of the transcendental stupidity of Flaubert. She quotes Flaubert remarking about the ending of Candide, Voltaire's novel. And I want to quote that passage from Flaubert. So this is Flaubert speaking. Of the ending of Candide, that tranquil conclusion, stupidity, like life itself, is for me the striking proof of Voltaire's genius. Neither melodrama nor synthesis, neither disaster nor success. The ending is calm and even mediocre, trailing off, explicitly rejecting reflections on the final state of affairs. It asserts its own reality and stops there. Stupid, like life itself, end quote. When we observe the stupidity of others, we see the merely empirical fact of stupidity, a superficial manifestation of the nonsense that can hang between a person and the facts around them. A person's particular exhibition of a lack of intelligence is a merely empirical presentation of nonsense. A person is dumb in such a situation in a derivative sense. To be sure, they have nothing to say. They're dumb insofar as it has been judged that anything that comes out of their mouth might better to have not come out at all. But stupidity in a transcendental sense betrays the mute dumbness before nonsense. When we say that la bêtise is transcendental, that it is a structure of thought, we mean that nonsense is a condition for the emergence, the origination, the genitality, the birth of thinking. Genitality is Deleuze's, is a technical term for Deleuze. Perhaps for Flaubert, stupidity is in the sense of a gaping mouth and a dumb stupefaction before the unspeakable flow of life itself, is an indication, a mark of human finitude. The tragedy for Flauberian humanity is that despite the frenzy and desperation that drives humans to stop the flow of life in order to render it simple, it will have always already remained nonsense. Stupid, like life itself. And while this may be the point at which Flaubert stops, Deleuze begins here. For him, stupidity is a structural condition of thought. From the transcendental point of view, nonsense occasions thinking. Among the conceptual structures that support common sense and the image of thought that Deleuze is criticizing, Deleuze points to Platonic anamnesis, Platonic recollection or recognition. However, it may have been, according to Deleuze, Plato himself who pointed out the direction for the reversal of this form of Platonism. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze mobilizes Plato's concept of aporia, of the impasse. But from the myriad of examples in the Platonic corpus in which the torpedo fish appears, he chooses a passage from Book 7 of the Republic that brings the aporia to bear on the faculty of sense. This is Deleuze's translation, I believe. Well, it's my translation of Deleuze's French translation of the Greek, and Socrates is speaking with Glaucon. Socrates. There are certain things, imperceptible beings, that do not invite thought to examine them, because perception suffices to determine them. And there are others which in every way engage thought in this examination, since perception gives nothing sound. Glaucon. You obviously mean distant appearances or perspective paintings. Socrates. You have not understood my meaning at all. Socrates here describes how, in certain rare and unplanned occasions, sensuous encounters engender thought. The faculty of sense encounters beings that it cannot determine, cannot comprehend, that stupefy it. In such circumstances, thought is then, in every way, forced into being. On my reading, By quoting this passage, Deleuze gathers before the reader a constellation of themes that persistently circulate in difference and repetition. First, one is immediately struck by distinction being made between the transcendental structural organization of thought and stupidity and the empirical fact of stupidity of others. Socrates relates a phenomenon that demonstrates the transcendental organizational role that stupefaction plays in the emergence of nous, of thought. It is a condition for the possibility of thinking as such. Glaucon's reply, that Deleuze describes as already Cartesian, draws upon the merely empirical example of the confusion of the faculty of sense. And as such, he fails to grasp the necessary structural organization in which thinking becomes pride from its complacent rest in common sense. Secondly, the passage enables Deleuze to locate the origination of thought in the faculty of sense. The encounter with Socrates' perceptible being remains fundamentally incapable of conceptual recognition. It exceeds all conceptual forms of mediation that I possess. I cannot recall the being, I cannot imagine it, I cannot cognize it. When sensibility is stung by the torpedo fish, the unity of the faculties is broken. Thereby, the supporting structure of common sense and recognition is disrupted. With nothing to cognize or to recognize, the encountered cannot even be described as a being of sense or a sensible being. Rather, Deleuze writes that, quote, "It is not an aestheton, but an aestheteon. It is not a sensible being, but the being of the sensible," end quote. Perhaps it can be said that the encounter contains no graspable content. It's not a substance, or quality, or quantity or magnitude that one faces in the fundamental encounter, the encounter that engenders thought, but it is the being of these things. As such, the faculty of sense holds a position of primacy in Deleuze, insofar as it is within sense that a curious split is formed that constitutes the ecosystem of thinking. The sensuous being experienced by sense in the fundamental encounter, the being that awakens the faculty of sense from its slumber, remains insensible from the point of view of common sense and recognition, and yet this can only be sensed. Given that sense is not in possession of a conceptual mechanism by which to determine the encounter, there remains nothing that the faculties may subsume the encounter underneath, so that sense may recognize and determine the experience. Thus, sense awakens in the presence of nonsense. Quote, "Sensibility, in the presence of that which can only be sensed, and is at the same time only insensible, finds itself before its own limit, the sign, and raises itself to the level of a transcendental exercise," end quote. For Deleuze, sense comes to perceive its primacy when the sensuous encounter forces sense to awaken from the slumbers imposed upon it by structures of common sense and recognition. When it is freed from the function of merely mechanical determination of already calcified concepts. Nonsense that can only be sensed calls sense before itself. These reflections on the privilege of sensibility in the cultivation of thinking brush up against a third theme present in the quote from Plato: stupidity or stupefaction. When sense becomes engaged in the fundamental encounter with the being of the sensible, a stupefaction results. It is thus sensuous stupefaction which loosens the faculties from their static rest in the knowledge of common sense and generates a space for learning. Now, these two terms, knowledge and learning, are technical terms in this context for Deleuze, knowledge is going to be connected to the concept of common sense, whereas learning is connected to thinking here. For Deleuze, there exists a transcendental difference between these two terms. The comportment toward the world, which he calls knowledge, is one in which that world becomes organized as a composition of static identities. However, when this comportment is violated and disrupted through stupefaction, there arises the possibility of sensing the things of the world in novel relations and in novel assemblies. In other words, the world becomes organized in accordance with the structural configuration of learning. With this distinction, the critique of common sense does not nihilistically counter the calcified world that everybody knows with something like non-knowledge or anti-knowledge, but opens the transcendentally organized world of knowledge to one of learning. Stupidity thus yields a transcendental rupture, a rupture that reshapes the conditions of comportment. Stupefaction engenders a flow in the ground, so that thinking modestly opens itself to learning. From a transcendental perspective, learning already bespeaks a modesty, a humility before the facts. The comportment everybody knows of common sense becomes unreliable, and the propositions, the empirical facts, and knowledge systems that support everybody knows come to have an uncertain sense. For the sense of propositions is not found in the concepts that compose them. With the return to the concept of modesty, indifference, and repetition, the question from the beginning of the lecture reasserts itself. If philosophical modesty characterizes the initiation of thinking, if it is stupefaction before common sense that occasions the disruption of the everybody knows, then how do things stand with contemporary discourse, especially as our thinking adheres to the transcendental conditions that also animate those of social media? In contrast to the comportment of, say, cancel culture, which can be described as the mobilization and redistribution of a common sense self-assurance, the comportment of learning is perhaps best exhibited in, quote, someone with the necessary modesty, not managing to know what everybody knows, and modestly denying what everybody is supposed to recognize, end quote. Thank you.